Hello, YouTube returns compatriots. Look who shills Nestle starts peasants vessels. Hackers, whackers. I'm a useful idiot. And today I want to talk about terrorism. Terrorism and property rights. Terrorism and copyright control. And one theme we've seen a lot recently is the labeling of everything as terrorism, whether it's struggles for independence across the globe, whatever internal insurgents a country has, they're now labeled terrorists. And now we have returning veterans and constitutionalists and people who freely think labeled as terrorists. We have copyright now being included, as well as the drug war. And so they've successfully kind of lumped terrorism and the drug war together, and that's really convenient. Now it's going to be all about copyright control. And so this is part of this whole dragnet to get everything in the world that challenges the state, which will be a corporate government partnership. The state, anything that challenges the state will be labeled terrorism. And we're seeing that more and more and more. This is another component of that. So we'll have anti-terror powers going to the government and the corporations, and they will be used to go after non-terrorism related activities, which will now be called terrorism. And this is a result of concerted efforts by all kinds of different organizations. And once again, as I always point out, this is a government-corporate partnership, and they both have a lot to gain by this. And we've even seen copyright enforcement enforced by SWAT teams. So one of the things this tells us is that more and more the coercive powers of government are being used to protect corporate interests. Interpol operates like that on the international scale. But let's look at some of the highlights before we go into an analysis. And some of the highlights are focal points where we've seen property rights equated with terrorism. One is a CNET broadcast in 2005, and it said terrorists linked to copyright piracy is alleged. And what they were trying to suggest is that counterfeit DVDs and cigarettes may be funding terrorists, which is pretty laughable. And actually, this came to be utterly disproved, but how preposterous when they can use the opium trade and rich donors from Saudi Arabia. They certainly don't need to get into selling counterfeit DVDs of Indiana Jones movies and crappy cigarettes. So then the Senate Homeland Security Committee headed by John Stedman, the LA County Sheriff's Department, spoke at this Senate Homeland Security Committee, and he's a part of a police team of intellectual property investigators. And he said, quote, "Some associates of terrorist groups may be involved in intellectual property rights crimes. During the course of our investigations, we have encountered suspects who have shown great affinity for Hezbollah and its leadership," unquote. So that sounds utterly preposterous. And just to make sure we get a clear picture of just how ridiculous it is, Stedman went on to say that he had, quote, "seen Hezbollah flags and photographs of the group's leaders in homes that he raided, coupled with anti-Israel sentiments on the part of those arrested." And I find that to be quite a stretch to say we have a vast problem with terrorism using intellectual property right crimes and violations as revenue generators, and creating this connection between terrorism and corporate product. And in 2005, in Europe, the music and film industries were demanding that the European Parliament extend the scope of proposed anti-terror laws to help them prosecute illegal downloaders. So, yeah, all you people loading up your iPods with illegal music, they want you. In an open letter to members of Parliament, companies include Sony, BMG, Disney, and EMI have asked to be given access to communications data, records of phone calls, emails, and internet surfing in order to take legal actions against pirates and file sharers. Current proposals restrict use of such information to cases of terrorism and organized crime. So they're going to make the connection, like with the drug war, between copyright infringement terrorism, organized crime, and now piracy. And you'll notice, too, that they want access to phone calls, emails, and internet surfing so they can take legal action. So there's a great indicator of why telecommunications companies are so cooperative in this government NSA global surveillance state, because they're all in on it. The governments want to data mine to suppress the citizens and feed them propaganda, and the corporations want to access those same people and their data so they can market their own brand of propaganda. So that's one of the reasons why there's such affinity between corporations and governments' interest in the surveillance state. And there's also an article in Wired in 2008 where Attorney General Michael Mukasey told Silicon Valley executives that the theft of their inventions poses a threat to the nation's health and safety and fosters terrorism. So there we see, again, this connection with property rights, copyright control, and terrorism. And then last but not least, the RAND Corporation published a report in 2009 linking the proceeds of film pirating with funding of terrorist groups. And, of course, they don't mention the fact that the report was funded by the Motion Picture Association themselves. But anyway, to think once again that people are pirating films in order to finance terrorism seems to be a stretch to me. But what it does do is gives us a lot of explanation of why things are moving the way they are in the world. And that's what I'm going to get to now. And that's the analysis of why we see this copyright and infringement and piracy being labeled as terrorism. And I want to add as well, too, that Obama is making steps now to make illegal downloading, the kind of things that a lot of people are doing in YouTube. Any copyright infringement is going to be made from a misdemeanor to a felony. And so that is another upgrade in corporate property rights and using the government to enforce private corporate property. And so we see this blur. And so what we're seeing here is a prime example of what I talk about a lot in my videos, and that's the corporate-government partnership. And corporations and governments are becoming one and the same, and we're certainly seeing an obvious example of this with the NSA surveillance state. And now we're seeing what the telecommunications companies and the big corporations have at stake for the same kind of data mining that they're doing for the government. And that's another thing. We see this surveillance data partnership. Both corporate interests and government interests want to read your emails, listen to your phone calls, and look at your internet habits to feed you propaganda. That is a uniting factor in the surveillance data corporate government partnership. And we're blurring the lines between all crimes being labeled as terrorism. So pretty soon, any kind of crime is going to be labeled terrorism. And one of the reasons why we want everything to be labeled terrorism is because then it goes into the shadow judicial system and the shadow military system that exists alongside, where everything is outside the Constitution, outside of our civil rights, and there are no restraints, no oversight, and no limitations. And one of the reasons why this relationship is developing is because the corporations need the government's power of coercion. And these are the same kind of policies that Russia, China, and Iran use, of course. But that is the important change we're seeing. And this has a lot to do with all these trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well as the Atlantic Trade Partnership that Obama is working on right now. Both those are all about enforcing copyrights and enforcing patents and extending patents, and this whole protecting property rights of corporations using government regulation, using government enforcement. And so that's what unites all this, and that's why it's important to watch how the corporate governments that's taking over the world, this is what these trade agreements are about. This is the foundation of transcending sovereignty of nations, where the banks and corporations and transnationals will shuffle their money around the globe, not participate in normal society, and also enjoy setting up this blueprint where corporations will control everything and the government will only be used for corporate enforcement. And we're already seeing that in a lot of foreign policy in the world and domestic policy. And this is the foundations for the new global governments that everybody's been talking about for a long time. That's why it's important to focus on these copyright and property rights moves by the corporations, particularly in the context of globalization. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.